1972 was a turning point for horror. The genre was drifting away from polished studio chills and leaning into something stranger, darker, and more unsettling. This was a year where Gothic atmospheres collided with grindhouse energy, where psychological unease sat next to exploitation, and where horror started testing just how far it could push audiences. These films reflect a moment when horror felt unpredictable, mixing vampires, paranoia, folklore, and raw shock in ways that still linger today. Some were theatrical hits, others found their audience later through late-night broadcasts and video store shelves. Together, they capture a year when horror quietly reshaped itself. Let's rewind to 1972. Blacula, 1972. William Marshall brings Shakespearean gravitas to the title role in William Crane's landmark blaxploitation horror. An 18th-century African prince named Mamuwalde seeks Dracula's help ending the slave trade, only to be cursed with vampirism and sealed in a coffin for 2 centuries. When antique hunters ship his coffin to 1970s Los Angeles, Blacula awakens in a world transformed, beginning a bloodthirsty rampage while searching for a woman who might be his reincarnated wife. Marshall refuses to play the role as camp, instead bringing dignity and genuine tragedy to a character cursed for fighting injustice. His commanding presence elevates the material considerably, delivering classical horror performance in exploitation framework. Vanetta McGee plays Tina, the photographer who resembles Mamuwalde's lost love, their romance adding unexpected emotional weight. The film doesn't shy from its blaxploitation elements, funky soundtrack, contemporary LA settings, soul music clubs, while maintaining genuine Gothic horror atmosphere. The practical vampire effects are solid for the era, with Marshall's transformation makeup creating genuinely monstrous visage. Gene Page's score blends orchestral horror with funk grooves perfectly. Blacula succeeded both commercially and culturally, proving Black audiences wanted horror representation and that blaxploitation could encompass any genre. It spawned sequels Scream, Blacula Scream, and opened doors for more diverse horror casting. The Night Stalker, 1972. A Las Vegas reporter investigates a series of murders where victims are drained of blood, gradually realizing the killer is an actual vampire. Dan Curtis's television movie became a phenomenon, drawing massive ratings and proving horror could dominate primetime. Darren McGavin plays Carl Kolchak, the rumpled journalist whose dogged investigation puts him at odds with authorities more concerned with covering up supernatural truth than protecting citizens. McGavin's performance defines the film. Cynical, persistent, delivering sardonic narration that makes Kolchak feel lived in rather than heroic. He's a working-class reporter chasing truth even when it costs him everything. The vampire, played by Barry Atwater, is genuinely frightening. Not romantic or seductive, but monstrous predator with superhuman strength. Richard Matheson's script balances procedural investigation with mounting horror, treating the vampire as solvable problem requiring research and methodology. Curtis shoots Las Vegas with documentary-like attention to actual locations, the city's glittering facade hiding predatory darkness. The confrontations between Kolchak and the vampire are staged with real tension, emphasizing the creature's physical superiority. The Night Stalker's success led to sequel The Night Strangler and eventually a television series, establishing template for investigative horror that influenced The X-Files and countless others. It proved television horror could be genuinely effective and commercially successful. The Other, 1972. Twin boys live on a rural Connecticut farm in the 1930s, one outgoing and mischievous, the other withdrawn and disturbed. After a series of tragic accidents plague the family, their grandmother begins teaching them an old family game involving projecting consciousness into other beings. Robert Mulligan adapts Thomas Tryan's novel into slow-burn psychological horror that reveals its cards gradually. Chris and Martin Udvarnaki play the twins with unsettling authenticity, their performances capturing childhood dynamics while hinting at something profoundly wrong. Uta Hagen delivers a powerful turn as the Russian grandmother whose mystical teachings might have unleashed something dangerous. Diana Muldaur and John Ritter populate the family with characters whose fates become increasingly grim as the summer progresses. Mulligan shoots the period setting with Norman Rockwell beauty that makes the horror more disturbing by contrast. The rural farm should be idyllic childhood paradise, but cinematographer Robert Surtees captures shadows and spaces that feel threatening. Jerry Goldsmith's score adds layers of unease to scenes that appear innocent on surface. The film builds dread through suggestion and behavioral observation rather than explicit violence, trusting audiences to piece together what's happening. The climax delivers both revelation and genuine horror, recontextualizing everything that came before. The other represents intelligent literary horror, translated to film with patience and craft, never condescending to audiences or simplifying complex psychological territory. Whoever Slew Auntie Rue, 1972. Shelley Winters plays a wealthy American widow living in England who's never recovered from her daughter's death, keeping the child's mummified corpse in a locked nursery. Each Christmas she invites orphans to her mansion for elaborate parties, but when two resourceful children discover her secret, they become convinced she's a witch planning to fatten and eat them like Hansel and Gretel. Winters delivers characteristically unhinged performance, playing grief and madness with theatrical commitment that makes Auntie Rue simultaneously pitiable and threatening. Mark Lester and Chloe Franks play the orphans whose imaginations transform tragedy into fairy tale horror. Their certainty that she's a witch becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. The film operates as darkened version of Hansel and Gretel, where the children's assumptions drive them to increasing cruelty toward a woman who's damaged but not actually dangerous in the ways they imagine. Curtis Harrington directs with Gothic atmosphere, shooting the mansion's Christmas decorations and elaborate parties with visual richness that contrasts with the emotional decay beneath. The mummified child is genuinely disturbing practical effect, Rue's preservation of her daughter's corpse crossing from grief into grotesque delusion. The film's tragedy comes from misunderstanding escalating into violence, children's storybook logic meeting adult mental illness with horrific results. Whoever Slew Auntie Rue represents early 70s horror's interest in psychological damage and grande dame guignol, using a fading star's intensity to explore grief's destructive power. Vampire Circus, 1972. A cursed village faces supernatural revenge when a traveling circus arrives 15 years after the townspeople destroyed a vampire. The performers are all vampires or their servants, targeting the descendants of those who participated in the original staking. Hammer Films delivers one of their stranger entries, blending gothic horror with circus spectacle and psychedelic visuals unusual for the studio. Adrian Corey, Anthony Higgins, and John Mulder Brown populate the vampire circus with performers who seduce and destroy with theatrical flair. The circus setting allows for creative staging, trapeze artists who transform mid-flight, a Hall of Mirrors sequence where reflections don't match reality, a panther that's really a shape-shifting vampire. Robert Young directs with more visual experimentation than typical Hammer productions, using colored lighting and distorted angles. The practical transformation effects are ambitious for Hammer, with vampires changing into animals through dissolve effects and makeup work. The mirror maze sequence is particularly effective, using practical sets and careful blocking to create disorienting space where reality becomes unreliable. The village's plague subplot adds another layer of dread. They're already suffering when the vampires arrive to finish them. The film's sexual frankness pushes beyond Hammer's usual restraint, with the circus performers using seduction as hunting method. Vampire Circus represents Hammer attempting to modernize their formula with contemporary filmmaking techniques while maintaining their Gothic roots, creating something that feels transitional between their classic period and attempts to remain relevant in changing horror landscape. Demons of the Mind, 1972. An Austrian baron keeps his teenage children imprisoned in his estate, convinced they've inherited their mother's violent madness. When a traveling priest arrives offering experimental treatments and local villagers begin dying violently, Questions arise about whether the children are actually dangerous or if their father's obsession has created the very madness he fears. Peter Sykes directs one of Hammer's most psychologically complex films. Robert Hardy plays the Baron with intensity bordering on mania, his attempts to cure his children becoming abuse justified through aristocratic authority and pseudoscience. Shane Bryant and Gillian Hills portray the imprisoned siblings with appropriate damage and confusion. Patrick Magee brings unsettling presence as the priest whose treatments feel more like torture. The film explores themes of hereditary madness, incestuous obsession, and how patriarchal control creates the very dysfunction it claims to prevent. Cinematographer Arthur Grant shoots with more visual experimentation than typical Hammer productions, using expressionistic angles and fragmented editing to convey psychological instability. The practical gore effects are surprisingly explicit for Hammer, particularly during the village attack sequences. The film's sexual frankness and psychological complexity push beyond the studio's usual boundaries, creating something that feels more European art film than traditional Gothic horror. The ambiguity about whether the madness is real or constructed makes the horror more disturbing. Is this supernatural curse or generational trauma perpetuated through abuse? Demons of the Mind represents Hammer attempting to modernize and deepen their approach, trading simple monster stories for complex psychological territory. They're Coming to Get You. 1972. Jane arrives in London to stay with her sister and immediately plunges into paranoid nightmare. Visions of ritualistic violence, strange figures following her, and growing certainty that her life is in danger. Sergio Martino's Italian Giallo blends the genre's typical mystery thriller elements with occult horror and psychological uncertainty about what's real versus hallucination. Edwige Fenech plays Jane with escalating terror, her performance capturing genuine mental deterioration as evidence mounts that either she's losing her mind or being targeted by satanic cult. George Hilton provides her skeptical boyfriend, while Ivan Rasimov brings sinister charisma to the mysterious blue-eyed man who appears in her visions and reality. Marina Malfatti rounds out the cast as the neighbor who introduces Jane to the occult group that might be salvation or trap. Bruno Nicolai's score blends giallo jazz with occult atmosphere perfectly. The ritual sequences are impressively staged, with elaborate ceremonial elements and genuinely unsettling imagery. The film keeps audiences uncertain about Jane's reliability. Are the visions real supernatural threats or manifestations of trauma? The practical effects for the violent sequences are characteristically Italian in their explicitness. The climax forces revelation that recontextualizes the preceding ambiguity. They're Coming to Get You represents giallo expanding beyond crime thriller into occult territory, creating something that's simultaneously mystery, horror, and paranoid thriller about trust and perception. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, 1972. A theater troupe travels to a remote island cemetery for their director's twisted ritual, performing a ceremony to raise the dead as ultimate theatrical experience. What starts as elaborate prank becomes genuine nightmare when the dead actually rise and trap the group in a cottage, forcing them to survive until dawn. Bob Clark's early film operates as dark comedy horror with surprising bite beneath its amateur aesthetics. Alan Ormsby, who also wrote the script, plays the insufferably theatrical director whose arrogance and cruelty toward his troupe make him thoroughly unlikable. The supporting cast plays broadly, their performances matching the film's satirical edge about theater people and artistic pretension. The first half deliberately moves slowly, building character dynamics, and allowing the director's obnoxious behavior to create genuine audience desire for consequences. When the zombies finally rise, Clark stages their siege with real effectiveness despite obvious budget constraints. The makeup effects are crude, but achieve atmosphere through sheer commitment and numbers. The zombies move with genuine menace, surrounding the cottage in steadily growing horde. Clark shoots the nighttime sequences with genuinely eerie lighting, making the island feel isolated and dangerous. The dark comedy tone shifts into legitimate horror as the group realizes their situation is hopeless, and their director's arrogance has doomed them. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things gained cult status through midnight screenings and home video, appreciated for its mean-spirited humor and surprisingly effective zombie siege, despite clearly limited resources. Deathline, 1972. London Underground workers discover evidence of missing persons in abandoned tunnel sections, leading to the horrifying truth. A descendant of Victorian railway workers trapped in a 19th century cave-in has survived in the tunnels for generations, now a deformed cannibal hunting modern commuters for food and companionship. Gary Sherman's British horror operates as both creature feature and surprisingly empathetic tragedy. Donald Pleasance plays the detective investigating disappearances with working-class weariness, his performance grounded even as evidence points toward impossible explanations. David Ladd and Sharon Gurney portray the young couple who stumble into the creature's lair. Hugh Armstrong delivers remarkable performance as the tunnel dweller, playing him not as simple monster, but as damaged, lonely being, trying to survive using the only methods he knows. His attempts at speech, garbled, broken English mixed with animalistic sounds, make him pitiable despite his violence. Sherman shoots the London Underground with claustrophobic intensity, the tunnels becoming maze where civilization's veneer is stripped away. The practical makeup effects for the creature emphasize his humanity beneath deformity, rather than making him purely monstrous. The diseased, decaying woman he keeps as companion is disturbing precisely because it reveals his desperate need for connection. The film's most famous line, the creature's garbled "mind the doors," becomes tragic mimicry of railway announcements he's heard for decades. Deathline balances horror with unexpected compassion, understanding that monsters are often made by circumstance rather than born evil. Tower of Evil, 1972. Investigators arrive at a remote lighthouse island where archaeological students were found dead or catatonic, uncovering evidence of ancient Phoenician treasure and ritualistic violence. As a new expedition explores the ruins, the survivors' flashbacks reveal what happened during the first visit, while present-day investigators face the same threat. Jim O'Connelly's British horror blends slasher elements with archaeological mystery. The dual timeline structure builds tension as past horrors inform present danger. The lighthouse setting creates effective isolation, the island becoming trap where escape proves impossible once violence begins. The practical gore effects are surprisingly brutal for 1972 British horror, with explicit violence that pushes beyond typical restraint. The Phoenician angle provides mythology justifying the carnage while hinting at ancient evil protecting buried treasure. O'Connelly stages the attack sequences with real intensity, the killer moving through cramped lighthouse interiors with methodical efficiency. The film's structure influenced later slasher cinema, particularly the summer camp isolation and archaeological expedition setup that would become common. Tower of Evil represents British horror, embracing more explicit violence and American-style body counts while maintaining Gothic atmosphere, creating transitional work between hammer elegance and grindhouse brutality that would dominate later in the decade. If you love discovering forgotten horror and cult cinema, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the films time forgot. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.